Hello, everyone. My name is Lindsay Nelson, and I'm an associate professor at Meiji University in Tokyo. And today I'm going to be talking to you about haunted houses, and in particular, a Japanese film called Watashi Tachi no Ie, or Our House, which features a very unusual sort of house, as we shall see. So let me go ahead and share some of my slides with you here. So as you can see, the title of my talk today is This House is Alive, Uncanny Domestic Spaces in Kiyohara Yui's Our House. So an outline for today's lecture. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about this lecture's connection to the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, that are a part of this course. Then I'm going to talk about the concept of the architectural uncanny. And then I'm going to talk about the concept of home in Japan and how it has changed. And finally, I will talk about haunted houses in Japanese cinema and the film Our House from 2017. So let's start by talking about the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So today, I think that the SDG that I am particularly focusing on is this one, which is gender equality. As we will see in this lecture, I'm going to be talking about a film that is directed by a woman director, which is still kind of a rarity in Japan. The number of films directed by women in Japan is still quite small, although it is changing. And the film itself, I think, is also very much a film about the lives of women. Most of its characters are female characters, and it's very much a movie about home and domestic space, and women kind of trying to find their identities and their places in this mysterious space that they are inhabiting. So I would say that the overall theme of my talk today is women, families, and domestic space, and how that domestic space is often haunted or spooky in some way. And haunted houses have been a feature of literature and film for a very long time, but in particular, I feel like in the last 15 or 20 years, we have seen quite a few horror films, both in Japan and in other countries, that kind of feature a new take on the haunted house and what it means. You have a movie like The Inerasable from 2015, and a movie called Stigmatized Properties from 2020, which are both about this concept that exists in Japan of what are called jikobukken, or stigmatized properties. And these are houses or apartments where someone died, maybe under violent circumstances, or maybe they just died alone. And because of that, these properties are considered kind of bad luck. They're stigmatized. And so as a result, they're often cheap to rent. And needless to say, they're the subject of a lot of kind of spooky stories and ghost stories, but they're also just a cheap alternative in a city with notoriously high housing costs. So, some real estate companies actually advertise them as a kind of cheap alternative. And then you have a movie, two movies from 2020, The Night House, which is about a woman who is grieving the loss of her partner and discovers basically these strange plans, kind of blueprints for a house that's identical to their own, but it's built elsewhere. So kind of similar to today's film, actually. It's also kind of about a doppelganger house. And then the movie Relic from 2020, which is, I think, very much a movie about aging and the responsibility that often falls on young women to take care of their aging parents. And in this case, that takes place in a house that is kind of literally consuming its inhabitants. And there are sequences in the film where different characters seem to get trapped in the house. So these are just some examples of recent cinematic takes on the haunted house that we have seen. So going back to the film that I'm talking about today, which features a very particular kind of spooky house, I just want to share this quote from an interview with Nakata Hideo. He is the director who made the original Ring film back in 1998. And when he made his more recent film about stigmatized properties, he was interviewed about it, and he said this: as a director, when I'm asked what's scary about stigmatized properties, rather than traces or psychic phenomena, I think it's the previous inhabitants and how they lived their lives and met their ends, those haunting memories. So this is from Nakata. And then a little bit before that, the director I'm going to be talking about today was interviewed about her film, Our House. And she said something very interesting as well. She said, I think houses have memories. Houses know more than I do. So this idea of houses as a place, kind of a repository of memories, a place where they're sort of weighed down by the past and weighed down by these memories, will definitely come up in today's lecture. So I think my key questions for today's lecture are, first of all, what is home? How do we define home? And also, what makes it strange or frightening? I think often in scary movies, this safe space of home becomes strange or frightening. And what is it that makes it strange or frightening? And a similar question, what exactly does it mean for a house to be haunted? If we say that a house is haunted, what does that mean? And finally, what happens when the boundaries of a home are undefined? I think for a lot of us, we live in a space that has clear boundaries, that has doors that lock, that has windows. But when the boundaries are a little more vague, how does that make us feel? And what does that do to our sense of security and safety? And that leads me to a concept that was developed by Anthony Vidler in the early 1990s, building on the work of Sigmund Freud, which is that of the architectural uncanny. Now, you might have heard the word uncanny before. I think that in common usage, if we say that something is uncanny, we usually just mean that it's weird or creepy, or we might mean that it looks very much like something else, like person A bears an uncanny resemblance to person B. But the word actually comes from an essay that Sigmund Freud wrote called The Uncanny. And the original German word was unheimlich, which basically means unhomely or not of the home. And for Freud, the uncanny was specifically about a sort of safe space made creepy, the idea of the past that had been repressed, bubbling up to the surface again to make us feel upset. And so he gave the example of, walking into a space that you hadn't been there before, but then you suddenly felt like maybe you had been, like a piece of the past was coming back. So it's not just that something is creepy or weird, it's that the past, that something that had been repressed is kind of bubbling up to the surface again. And Anthony Vidler built on this concept to write about the architectural uncanny. So he specifically talked about buildings and homes and how the way they are built, the way they exist within a city or within the countryside can contribute to these feelings of uncanniness. So just a couple of quotes related to that from David Spur, writing about the architectural uncanny sometime later. He wrote that an architectural work gives a new shape to that space, while also establishing a new relation between the newly formed space and that which remains outside of it. And then Vidler, writing a little bit after his own first publication on this, wrote about the changing architectural forms and new forms of anxiety and phobia that started to become more common in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. He wrote, it is as if space, with its invasive and boundary-breaking properties, takes up anxiety for its own and carries it into the realms of aesthetic theory. So this idea of space being able to kind of create anxiety or take anxiety into its own hands. So continuing, another quote from Vidler, he wrote about the home specifically. The home has long been an especially favored site for uncanny disturbances, especially given that the uncanny is founded on the idea of a secure and homely interior and the fearful invasion of an alien presence. So home, the concept and the place are often the site of uncanny disturbances because this is a space that is seen as safe and secure, but the uncanny is all about something strange and alien invading that safe space. And then from much earlier, a quote from Bachelard: a home allows our imagination to build walls of impalpable shadows, comfort itself with the illusion of protection, the sheltered being gives perceptible limits to his shelter. So for Bachelard, this idea of home being a safe space is not really real. It's kind of an illusion, but it makes us feel good to think this way. So just to summarize all of those quotes, the arrangement of space affects us in a very powerful way. And this became particularly evident in the late 19th century when more and more people were living in cities and often in small, cramped spaces surrounded by crowds of people. We really began to see how space affected us. And the idea of home is a refuge and a comfort for many people, but in some ways, at least according to Bachelard, that comfort is an illusion. It's very easy for that space to be invaded by outside forces and to feel unsafe or uncomfortable, to feel uncanny. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the concept of home in Japan and home life in Japan then and now. So as some of you might be aware, the traditional Japanese home, if we're talking about a freestanding structure, a house that might have existed in the countryside or that still exists in cities and in the countryside, tends to have a certain layout. First of all, at least one room or maybe several rooms in the home are usually tatami. They're straw mat flooring that, as you can see in this photo here, that the futon are on top of. They're like rectangular blocks that are laid out in different rooms. And rooms are actually measured in how big they are in terms of tatami. Like we'll say, oh, that's a 4.5 mat room. That's a 6 mat room. And you get an idea of how big the room is. Also, rooms are typically divided not by open closing doors, but by shoji, by screens, sliding screens with paper windows. These days, it's more common for them to be plastic, but they have these wooden slats and white paper windows. And in that way, it was easy to kind of change the layout of the home at a moment's notice. So you could open the screens and the house would suddenly be very wide and open, or you could close them and then it would become, separate rooms. The house would become separate rooms. And as you can see in this photo, it was also very common for rooms to be multifunctional. So during the day, this room might have functioned as a living room. There might have been a table and some chairs in there. But then at night, you pull the bedding, the futon, out of the closet and you sleep in that room. And these houses are still existing in the countryside and in the city. There are still a lot of houses that look like this. However, in cities in particular, it's much more common these days for a lot of people to live in apartments, particularly single dweller apartments. And these often look like the one pictured here. They might just be a single room with a bed on one side of the room, maybe an air conditioning unit, a floor table, and then behind where the space from where the photo is being taken, there's a very small, maybe kitchen setup with like a sink and a burner, and maybe also a very small shower and toilet area. So that's one way that living has changed in Japan. You went from these large homes with family living together to a lot of people living on their own now. And the family structure in Japan too, for a long time, it was quite normal to have several generations under one roof. The wife would often move in with the husband's family and care for the husband's parents, and the children would also live there. These days, that's less common. A lot of children, when they become adults, move to the city and they can't afford a space large enough to house their whole family, so they live separately from their parents. And hundreds of years ago as well, the family structure was a little more nebulous. It was, family might have included not only parents, children, grandparents, might also have included uncles, cousins, even servants. So things were a little more nebulous in the past, I think, than they are now. And so a lot of things changed during the Meiji period. We can see this in particular through two very important words, ie and kate, and how they changed the concept of house and home in Japan. So the Meiji period was a time in Japan that is often associated with a lot of reforms, a lot of changes. There was a lot of exchange between Japan and other countries, a lot of adopting of foreign customs or just different customs. And one way that that change happened was in the home itself. First of all, as you can see from these two pictures, there were changes in the physical layouts of the home, where a lot of homes started to incorporate more European style layouts, where instead of a table on the floor, you had a higher table with chairs. Instead of futon, you had beds. And instead of tatami flooring, you might have more wood flooring. So that was one way that things had changed. This was also a period when the government basically codified the family structure, where it had been a little more nebulous in the past. They created this concept of the Iesedo, or the family registry system, where the family was very clearly defined as the father being the head of the household, and then a wife and children, and that was the family. There was no longer this sort of nebulous group of like aunts, uncles, cousins, servants. It was, this heteronormative nuclear family was the family structure. And so you had a big change in orientation within the home. Just the act, of sitting in chairs at a table kind of changed the way people, moved and sat in a home, where in the past, everybody might have sat on the floor and eaten dinner on their own trays. Now suddenly it was encouraged, for families to eat dinner together. So like 4 people would sit at a table and have dinner together. And you also had this IE system, which was a very public system. You had to publicly register your family as part of the Iesedo. But then you had this other word, kate, which is often seen as a more feminine word. This word could mean family or household, but it was kind of considered maternal. The kate, the nurturing of the kate, was seen as the woman's responsibility. And this is the domestic space of the home that is private. And yet, the concept of the IE was very public. So you had this kind of push-pull between this very public government system and this private domestic space that a woman was responsible for. And so Jordan Sand writes that discourse on domestic space during this time molded a modern family that was both bounded and unbounded. On the one hand, the morally charged space of the home was a private space, but its functions were exported to the outside institutions such as the schools, and domestic life was ordered according to ideas and information from outside. So in that light, I think we have to consider the haunted or uncanny house in Japan, in Japanese cinema. You have to think of it in terms of frequently shifting conceptions of what constitutes house, home, and family. Also the idea of women's spaces. What is a woman's space? Why is domestic space so connected to women? And just the porous borders between public and private. So on the one hand, you had this idea of the public space and private space, but as we can see with IE and kate, it was kind of vague. It wasn't always certain, what was public and what was private. And just like in any other horror tradition, the haunted house has been a big part of Japanese horror films for a long time. My own research specializes in Japanese horror films, so this is what I've been paying attention to. Maybe the most famous example of this is the Grudge film series, the Ju-on series, which started in 2000 and continues today, which focuses on this one suburban house, a sort of traditional Japanese house, where something horrible happened, and now anybody who comes into contact with that house is cursed in some way. You have a movie like Dark Water from 2002, which is about a single mother and her daughter trying to make a life for themselves and living in a kind of rundown apartment building. So, in contrast, say with a more traditional family structure, you have a woman and her daughter living in this, it's not really a single dweller apartment, it's like a 2-bedroom apartment. And then, as I mentioned before, you have a movie like The Inerasable, which is all about these stigmatized properties that various people are living in. So that leads me to today's film, which is Watashi Tachi no Ie, which was released in English as Our House, released in 2017 and directed by Kiyohara Yui. So let's just take a look at the trailer for this film so that you can get a sense of what it looks like.
学校帰りに琴江と秘密の浜に行った。小学生の頃から行っているあの場所は全然変わらない。明日朝起きたら誰も家にいないかも。そうなったらいいな。でもそうなったら嫌だな。
目が覚めたら全てが消えていたんです。
歌おう朗らに共に手を取りラララララララララララアヒルさんガーガー。
こんな花瓶あったっけ？
はい。
そちらの居場所はとっくに突き止めているんです。
天井の小さな埃を数えたら14個。もうすぐ誕生日が来る。
こんばんは。
誰かいるの？
いつまでもいたらいいよ。
Okay. So obviously, this film is directed by a woman, which, as I mentioned, is kind of rare in Japan. So specifically, just one statistic that is kind of shocking. Of the 796 films released in Japan between 2000 and 2021 that grossed over 1 billion yen, so that's about 10 million US dollars, only 25 were directed by women. So that's a really small number, and this is a courtesy of the Japanese Cinema Project, this data. Also, Japan's version of the Me Too movement has been kind of slow to develop, but just in the last couple of years, there have been quite a few allegations of sexual assault and harassment against very well-known Japanese directors, actors, and producers. And basically what has been revealed is just that the problem of sexual assault and harassment in the Japanese film industry was very serious and had been very common for a long time, and just kind of revealed that the Japanese film industry is a very, very hostile place to work for women. It's also just a very abusive environment in general. There's a lot of overwork and exploitation and low pay. But in particular for women, it was just very unsafe, and it unfortunately continues to be unsafe. There have been some initiatives to kind of address this problem, but it's still a very big problem. And even beyond sexual assault and harassment, a lot of women who work in the film industry just say that the incredibly long hours, there isn't really a lot of union protection in Japan, mean that if you have children, for example, it's just very difficult to keep working in the film industry after you have children. So for that and many other reasons, the number of women directors, successful women directors in Japan is very small, and continues to be so. So let's go ahead and talk about this film, Kiyohara Yui's 2017 film, Our House. So this film builds on the tradition of haunted houses as repositories of repressed memories. Produced as one of 4 films in the Tokyo University of the Arts Graduate Works Collection in 2017, Our House won the grand prize at the Pia Film Festival and was shown briefly at Tokyo's Eurospace Theater before being released as part of a 4-DVD box set. Kiyohara worked closely with veteran J-horror filmmaker Kurosawa Kiyoshi, and his influence is arguably visible in the film in its careful attention to lighting and shots that feature characters framed within frames. Let's take a look at the film's opening scene.
うしたの？
今なんか音しなかった？
どんな音？
シャッターの音、ガラガラって。
気のせいだよ。
誰かが帰ってきたのかと思った。
So this opening immediately kind of puts us in a strange place. The music feels kind of 80s, but a lot of the girls are wearing old-fashioned nightgowns. Also, why are they dancing in a circle and doing what looks like choreography inside with the lights off? Sounds kind of odd. When one of the girls turns on the light and says that she thought she heard someone enter the house, it sets a certain tone. Throughout the movie, people will be uncertain about whether someone else is in their house. So the film initially depicts a teenage girl, the teenage girl we saw in that clip, Seti, and her single mother living in an unusual home. The two-story interior features tatami flooring, shoji dividers, and a steep wooden staircase. But the entrance, as you can see in this image here, is a metal roll-up grating that is more common to commercial shops or offices. About 13 minutes into the film, we suddenly shift to a ferry and meet two new characters. A young woman wakes up on the ferry with no memory of anything but her name, Sana. The mysterious Toko, who Sana first encounters having a secretive phone conversation on the ferry, takes her home, to a home that is clearly the exact same space where teenage Seti and her mother live. As the film progresses, there are no clear answers to the questions raised by this. Occasionally, Sana or Seti seem to hear sounds through the walls and the shoji that could be the house's other inhabitants. When asked if she lives alone, Toko doesn't reply, and her vague answers to other questions make us wonder if she's aware of the house's other inhabitants. A mysterious gift that Sana found in her bag somehow ends up in the other house, but we never find out what's inside. Ultimately, the film offers few answers to many of the questions it raises. So let's take a look at a few clips from the film.
そうだ。誕生日会どうする？
私のこと探してる人がいるかな。
眠れた？
はい。
私学校行ってもお腹減んないもん。
あったかい。
ずれてる。子供服を直してるの。得意なんだ。
借りつける？
So as you can see from those clips, this one home serves as a living space for two different pairs of women. It's decorated slightly differently, but it is clearly the same house. The women are mostly unaware of each other, but every now and then there are hints that they hear each other, like the moment when teenage Seti pokes a hole in the shoji screen, and then later Sana notices the hole and says, "Was this hole always here?" Like Asato Mari's Bilocation, which used the motif of the doppelganger to comment on women's divided selves and the pressure to always play multiple roles, our house uses a doubled house to reveal the porous boundaries between the outside world and the supposedly private, bounded world of the home. Where typical Japanese homes' thin walls might make its inhabitants privy to the comings and goings of neighbors, in our house, thin boundaries between worlds make the characters wonder if their private home is really private and, more fundamentally, wonder who they really are. Scenes repeat with slight differences. Seti and her mother eat at a low table on the first floor, and Sana and Toko do the same. Teenage Seti and her school friend giggle and tease each other on the second floor, and soon after, Sana and Toko run around the same space, singing and giggling like teenagers. Sana unpacks her bag upstairs as she tries to make sense of who she is and where she came from, while Seti packs a bag as she prepares to run away from home. Both pairs of women enact day-to-day domestic routines, cooking, cleaning, sewing, putting on makeup, and questioning who they are and what they should do. For both pairs of women, the space is clearly a home and a space of refuge, but even if there are no obvious supernatural entities in the film, ghosts linger in the form of past and adjacent lives lived in the house. The house depicted in the film also serves, like so many haunted houses before it, as a repository of memories and experiences. But it's often uncertain whether the strange noises heard in the house are echoes of a past or an adjacent present, creeping around the house's periphery, but mostly unable to penetrate it. Those pasts and presents are often connected to mysterious or absent men. During Seti's birthday party, one of the guests asks another guest if one of the house's pillars just creaked. "This house is alive," another guest comments. "This house is healthy, even though he left ages ago," Seti's mother replies. He is the absent father/husband whose presence lingers in the house in the form of odd noises and a Christmas tree that Seti insists on putting up early, still convinced that her father might come back one day. Returning home late at night and hearing strange noises in the house, Seti calls out for her father. Seti is hostile to her mother's new boyfriend, particularly when her mother suggests that they might marry and he might move into the house with them. In the other house, meanwhile, men make mysterious phone calls to Toko. Sana catches one man leaving the house with a large box. Sana meets a man named Natsuki at a cafe, and when he shows up uninvited at the house, Toko gives him an icy reception. In both of its versions, the house is a space for women, but men lurk on the periphery and in the house's past, raising questions about exactly where the house's boundaries begin and end. The depiction of amnesiac Sana within the strange, porous domestic space of the film's house also raises questions about how much anyone can ever truly know about themselves or others, particularly when the very ground beneath their feet feels less than solid. After returning to the house with Toko, Sana announces that she has filed a missing persons report for herself, we assume. Toko, who exhibits an oddly flat affect throughout the film, seems unperturbed by Sana's situation. As they lie awake beside each other on futons on the second floor of the house late at night, Sana wonders aloud who she is. "No one can prove who they are," Toko says. Sana criticizes Toko for refusing to answer questions about the strange phone call she's been receiving or why she turned up wet and muddy late one night. "I don't even know anything about myself. Why can't I know about you?" Sana tells her. As they argue one evening near the end of the film, the power in the house suddenly goes out, and they find themselves in total darkness. Fumbling in the dark, they find each other, touching each other's faces with eyes closed as they say, "I'm here." The shot is filmed in close-up with just enough light to show us their faces and hands. This, it seems, is the only way Sana and Toko will ever truly know each other, with a sense of fumbling uncertainty, never being able to see the full picture, not unlike the strangely abandoned, unbounded house that they live in. Uncertainty about identity also plays out in the depiction of teenage Seti, and in particular the way that she is frequently shot reflected in multiple mirrors or bounded within the squares of a shoji screen. In her first scene, she sits at the low table on the first floor of the house, eating breakfast and reading a newspaper. She is filmed from a distance with the camera positioned in the home's entryway, so we see only her face within one square of the shoji. The camera then switches to a close-up, her face still within the square of the shoji. Later, Seti sits at her desk upstairs and writes in her diary. She glances toward the audience and her face is again in one square of many multicolored squares in the shoji. We also see the reflection of her body behind her as she looks toward the audience. Later, as she puts on elaborate makeup and plays dress up with her school friend, we see her reflection in her mother's makeup mirror and yet another mirror off to the side. Her affect switches between childish and attempts at adultness, teasing her mother and giggling with her friend before putting on more mature clothing and shouting at her mother or running away from home to assert her independence. She seems particularly enraged when her mother's boyfriend gives her a stuffed toy as a gift. From the beginning, the question of who Seti is plays out both in her dialogue, which shifts between attempts at rebellion and childish jokes with her mother, and the way she is framed in a box that she doesn't want to be in and reflected in multiple surfaces to the point where the real Seti is difficult to find. Of all the characters, Seti also seems to be the most aware that something is not right in the home. In the film's opening scene, as she dances upstairs with a group of girlfriends, she suddenly pauses and asks the other girls if they heard the sound of a shutter closing. Later, she wakes up in her own bedroom, but objects hanging on the walls make us wonder if she has somehow been transported into the other house. She pokes a hole through the paper of a shoji screen and looks through it, and Sana later notices the hole in her house and also looks through it. Coming home late one night, Seri hears noises upstairs and calls out, asking if her father is there. As the film cuts back and forth between two tracking shots showing the upstairs hallway, each one in a different version of the house, Seri eventually picks up the glass vase that was a gift from her mother's new boyfriend and tosses it through the air. It shatters on the ground, startling Sana and Toko in the other house.
お父さんなの？違う。誰？
停電ですかね。ブレーカー見てきましょうか。
動かないで。
動いてないです。
瞳子。
Finally, in the film's last moments, Sana searches for the mysterious gift that she found in her bag, one that she has put off opening throughout the film. It has vanished, and we now see it in the dining area of Seri and her mother's home, where Seri wonders if it's one of the gifts from her birthday party that she didn't open. Let's take a look at that clip now.
瞳子ここにあったプレゼントどっかにやった？
知らない。さっきまであったんだけどな。どこかにあるよ。あれ、こんなのもらったっけ？
開け忘れたんでしょ。これおばさんがくれたのじゃない？
おばさんからはピンクのネズミだったよ。
じゃあなんだろう。開けてみたら？
As we can see from this clip, the film's ending is ambiguous. The boundaries between the two houses and two worlds seem to have been breached, but we don't know what this means for the characters or the worlds they live in. Throughout all of this, the mysterious house at the center of the film serves as another central character, both itself and its double, familiar and strange, the same space but slightly different. Ostensibly, the house serves as a space of refuge for all these women to reckon with the uncertain pasts, presents, and futures. But the house's status as a space of refuge is, like most fictional homes, an illusion. It is, in fact, an unbounded, shifting space, one that rejects the usual laws of space and time and invites a constant sense of uncertainty about where its walls begin and end. There may be no recognizable ghosts or spirits in the house, but it is still haunted by memories and experiences, both of the people who inhabited it before the film began and the others, distant yet close by, who inhabit it in an alternative space and time. It is a space where the imaginations of the film's female characters can build walls of impalpable shadows and comfort themselves with the illusion of protection, to go back to Bachelard. The house's two versions are experienced as both alien and familiar, all the more fearsome because apparently the same, to quote Vidler. Like any home or domestic space, even one that does not exist simultaneously in two worlds, this house provides only the illusion of refuge and certainty. The reality is unbounded, porous, and uncertain, an appropriate location for the questioning journey of its female characters. All right, there you can see my social media information and also sources for this lecture. Okay, let me just stop sharing the screen there. All right, thank you very much for your attention.